I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to Bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Kourtney.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well. Before we started recording, you and I were talking about the weather, the heat.
Yeah. I'm living in a heat wave right now, but it's okay.
Yeah. I don't know why I brought up the weather. There are more interesting things to talk about. Like, for example, I guess I was talking about the weather because it's hot in LA and Sacramento. And you know what else is hot?
Hot Shakespeare summer.
That's right. There we go. That's the tie-in. I knew there was a purpose for talking about the weather for once.
But first, welcome to today's episode. Today we are discussing patriarchy and the representation of women in Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Yes, that is right. I'm excited to get into my research, but also first we have a little bit of housekeeping.
Right. We are still in the middle of our Hot Shakespeare Summer over on Instagram. If you are going to see, or if you are involved in a Shakespeare production this summer, we encourage you to share it with us on social media by using hashtag Hot Shakespeare Summer and tagging us at Shakespeare Anyone Pod on Instagram. A select number of people every month will win some prizes for participating in Hot Shakespeare Summer. We had winners for June, and we've just announced our winners for July over on Instagram. If you want to participate and your profile is private, feel free to send us a message or email us at hello@shakespeareanyone.com. And we would love to hear from you and see what you are doing this Hot Shakespeare Summer.
Yes. And I actually had a 10-day Hot Shakespeare Summer in Verona for the Verona Shakespeare Fringe Festival. I saw theater from 10 different theater companies from across the globe and shared that experience over on Patreon. So if you want to hear about my Hot Shakespeare Summer in Verona, please go to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone and join our wonderful community and help support the podcast. We are primarily listener funded, so thank you in advance.
And you'll also get access to all of our other behind the scenes, or what we call Beyond the Pod, and bonus content.
Yeah, it's a good time over on Patreon, so we'll see you there.
Now, let's dive into our topic today, which is, as I said earlier, patriarchy and depictions of women in The Tempest.
I'm going to start by sharing my research, which was from the article Seduction and Service in The Tempest by Melissa E. Sanchez. We have discussed this scholar's research before in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's our sexuality or Shakespeare's horny play, I think is what we called it.
Yes.
I think that The Tempest is super interesting in terms of feminism, patriarchy, representations, depictions of women characters. And it only has one woman in the dramatis personae, and that is Miranda.
Right. We have two other female characters that exist in this world and are named, but we do not see them on stage ever, Sycorax and Claribel. And then presumably Prospero had a partner, Miranda had a mother, but we don't know her name. We don't learn anything about her.
Yeah, exactly. So Miranda really is the only woman character on stage, and Sanchez in this piece, quote, makes legible a contemporary political discourse that likened the relation of sovereign and subject to that of the husband and wife, unquote. And this discourse about the sovereign and the subject, husband, wife, the Elizabethan policies prior to James had been critiqued in Philip Sidney's Arcadia and Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. And one thing that Sanchez points out at the top of the article is that criticism of The Tempest tends to focus on the masculine struggles in the play, but courtship and politics were prominent in the play itself. Think of Miranda and Ferdinand. And those sorts of struggles were also a prominent part of Stuart discourse.
Mm.
And Sanchez also points out that criticism of The Tempest tends to focus on post-colonial narratives. And in these criticisms, the women characters tend to be consigned to the status of passive objects within the play's politics rather than active participants. And I'm not surprised by that because in our Stuff to Chew On, we learned that academics, scholars, creative people were really disinterested in Miranda until around the second wave of feminism. So like the 60s, 70s, like there's this vacuum of a couple hundred years where people aren't writing about Miranda, the only woman in the play.
Yeah.
And so in this article, Sanchez proposes that the erotic dimension of the women figures, so that's Miranda, also references to the widow Dido, allusions to Sycorax and Claribel, this disrupts simple narratives of dominance, submission, and revolt. And so within this article, we're going to be exploring women not as passive, but as active characters. The principal way to really examine Miranda as an active character is through the marriage negotiations that she goes through with Ferdinand and, vis-a-vis Prospero. But Sanchez looks to this marriage to, quote, demonstrate that subjects will ideally consent to be ruled, unquote, while also acknowledging the precariousness of narratives that, quote, base political order on fickle desire rather than resolute force, unquote. So again, this article is rooted in the discourse about Stuart courtship and politics, rule versus being ruled.
Mm.
And I promise it'll make more sense once I go through the historical context of the Stuart discourse. James, his subjects, his court.
Mm-hmm.
By the second scene of The Tempest, we learn that Miranda is Prospero's daughter, and we also learn that she is suitable for marriage. And the central plot of The Tempest, which actually really is Miranda and Ferdinand's marriage, is an arrangement that ultimately secures public harmony and stability between Naples and Milan. But there also is inconsistency between how Miranda and Prospero view her betrothal. Also, it's uncertain in the play where Prospero's control ends and Miranda's control begins. So this inconsistency between Miranda and Prospero and this idea of like who has control, who is in power, and who is subjugated, this registers tensions that existed between the absolute theories of James I and the practical and ideological issues expressed in Parliament, especially after the Great Contract. So that's capital G, capital C. And the Great Contract failed in 1610. And the Great Contract was a plan submitted by Parliament to increase the Crown's income, but also to ultimately rid it of debt. And in Stuart government, there were these uncontested areas of sovereign power that were increasingly up for debate. So James had a certain amount of uncontested power that the government, the Commons, were constantly at battle with. James emphasized the reciprocal duties of the ruler and the ruled with duties of man and woman in order to assert that the English populace, not passively, but actively accepted its subordinate status. And he wrote about this, which is no surprise to us. He wrote about this in The True Law of Free Monarchies, or the Reciproc of Mutual Duties Betwixt a Free King and His Natural Subjects. And in this, James used passages from the Bible to support his argument and also assure his subjects that, quote, an ideal commonwealth monarch and people will gladly bridle their tyrannous impulses to forge a stable relationship of mutual love and care, one more akin to the service of courtship than to the slavery of conquest, unquote. So within this work, he blazons a passionate longing in his subjects and a demand for satisfaction from the king. It's this like seduction and service. Those two things are tied together. So this is, according to Sanchez, consent and reciprocity, as well as language of erotic investment in law and monarchy. So there's this kind of courtship that is referenced, this kind of very romantic, very erotic sexual kind of framing that James uses.
He ties the relationship of the ruler and the ruled into this sort of like romantic sexual frame.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And the House of Commons opposed this discourse because they argued that their participation in government was their ancient right. And they responded to James in the form of the Forms of Apology and Satisfaction in 1604, which criticized James as not a free monarch if affection and self-interest are connected in policy. So James's writing was about the free monarch and his natural subjects. But if he has to court his subjects, he's not really a free monarch. There's a give and
he's
take.
not really ruling if he has to like.
You have to win over your natural subjects, but if they are natural, then you just rule.
You shouldn't have to. Yeah.
Yeah. And so during this time period, there is this discourse of love that was a critique of James's fiscal and political duties. It was prominent in James's time, but it also existed in Elizabeth's time too. She used this kind of love in her politics too to win over her subjects. But Parliament was really critical of James's use of this discourse of love. However, during his first years as king, James actually spent up to 6 months of the year in the countryside hunting. And this kind of distance from his subjects was perceived as a lack of concern for his subjects' desires, needs, and rights, and resulted in protests. And Sanchez recounts that there was one incident where locals kidnapped James's favorite greyhound and typed a letter of complaint to him because he was in the countryside for 6 months away from his subjects.
Yeah.
And so
ghosting them for 6 months after
using all these
after love bombing them.
Exactly. He love bombed his subjects and then up and left for 6 months. And it's like, you're right, it's love bombing, but there's this kind of in the first few years of his kingship, he really was courting his subjects.
A lot of promises, a lot of
Exactly. And in the Tempest, there are debates about duties and rights of sovereign and subject that adopt the vocabulary of love and service. And Prospero has 3 subjects: Miranda, Ariel, and Caliban. And though Prospero imagines his subjects have unquestioning obedience to his benevolent rule, the play actually offers more dynamic engagement in love and service from each of his subjects. So, Ariel, the play suggests that Ariel has a voluntary, joyful submission to Prospero, but he also, in his first entrance, offers to go anywhere his master is not. So Ariel mentions air, water, fire in his limitless devotion, but he also admits the terrestrial setting where Prospero's plan unfolds. So
he's also constantly like, when are you going to free me?
You're a little ahead.
Okay.
You're no, but I love that you're ahead of the game. We learn in the beginning of the play that Ariel conjured the storm, but it was out of self-interest for freedom, not for his natural affection and devotion to Prospero. And in his first entrance, there's this language of liberties that resonated with the 17th century ancient liberties that I mentioned earlier, that common lawyers and MPs claimed against expanding royal prerogative. And Prospero simultaneously ignores the original contract that he had with Ariel. And his response, instead of acknowledging the original contract, is that he reminds Ariel of the agony that Ariel lived under during the island's previous ruler, Sycorax. So he's gaslighting Ariel, basically.
Right.
So this idea of love and service is maybe not so cut and dry with Ariel as people think. But actually, there's some complicated...
There's resistance from Ariel, and there's like threats from Prospero.
Exactly. And this memory of Sycorax may also address there's this issue of sexual hierarchy that exists on the island, because Sycorax's rule was a female rule, and that was an inversion of the patriarchal order from the 17th century. Similar to Elizabeth, Sanchez didn't write about Elizabeth, but I find that interesting that the previous ruler was a woman who also didn't submit to the influence of a husband or a father. The idea of Sycorax being the previous ruler of the island that Prospero has to like harken back to as being so horrible is an interesting thought to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel that I've personally never considered before. So that's like, and I'm like, oh, like how to look at this play through the lens of like a power shift that that you and I specifically have often seen some of these plays depict of like, of the regime change between Elizabeth and James.
Put a pin in it for another episode, or if there's a vacuum in research. But things are different with Caliban. Caliban suggests that there is tension between consent and coercion, between the sovereign subject bond. There was mutual service that turned to tyranny and slavery. And actually, if we're looking at like the seduction and service that is Sanchez's framing, the description of their meeting fuses sexual and geopolitical conquest, with Caliban recounting how Prospero strokes and made much of Caliban. He shows all these gestures of kindness and caresses and encouragement and kind of like a coercion for like the sovereign subject relationship that came out of this eroticism, caresses, encouragement. And that is why Caliban voluntarily became a servant or a subject of Prospero. So Prospero legitimized his power over Ariel and Caliban through some sort of coercion. You know, there's consent to be ruled, but it's rather coercive. And Prospero, he wins this struggle of legitimacy by acknowledging that legitimacy requires a form of consent. So now I want to talk about Miranda and the dynamic between her and Prospero and the men on the island, and this idea of service and seduction, love and service, because Miranda actually is quite an independent agent who, Sanchez writes, voluntarily accepts her subordinate domestic and political status. She is, in a way, subject to her father, but she also thinks that she's rebelling when it comes to the betrothal between herself and Ferdinand. She is acting out technically a predetermined role in her father's plot, but she doesn't know that. She has no idea that Prospero's real intention is to wed her off to Ferdinand. And so she thinks that she is taking his orders at face value and she is disobeying him. So she enters this union with Ferdinand willingly, and she echoes Ariel and Caliban's defiance of Prospero's authority.
Yeah, she also challenges him conjuring the storm and says, like, if she had his power, she would be doing something different.
Yeah. And it's actually Miranda's consent to marriage that is essential to establishing the legitimacy of Prospero's return to power. But Claribel, her situation demonstrates that enforced obedience may actually be problematic for a ruler and state. Alonso and Prospero are both willing to exploit their daughters for political uses, but Alonso reveals his domestic tyranny by compelling Claribel to marry against her will. And then Alonso regrets the marriage. He sees that there are consequences to disregarding his subjects' rights in his quest for political success. And this comes in the form of him thinking that Ferdinand dies. He mourns what he did to his daughter because his only son and heir, he thinks, died.
Is dead.
Yeah.
And now his daughter is far away and out of his control, and he cannot, like, for lack of a better way of saying it, further use her to secure heirs.
Yeah.
Okay.
He sees this as like poor judgment. He shouldn't have done this. And there are consequences to his actions, but they're not really about his daughter. They're about
his political legacy and, power.
Exactly. On the other hand, the coupling of Miranda and Ferdinand ties seduction and service together in a way that's not for political quests, political legitimacy. Miranda and Ferdinand, unlike Prospero, Caliban, Alonso, the couple themselves, they adopt the romance language of mutual erotic bondage in a way that defies this narrative of mastery and subjugation. Both Ferdinand and Miranda devote themselves in love and also service to each other. So Ferdinand says that he is doing Miranda's service when he gladly accepts his job in manual labor. And Miranda similarly, and also Sanchez mentions Juliet-like, which I love that because Juliet is much more active in her relationship with Romeo than people give her credit for. Yeah.
Thanks.
But yeah. Miranda instigates the transition from courtly compliments to conjugal reality when she proposes to the son of her father's enemy and, quote, suggests that Ferdinand has little choice in the matter, unquote. So when she's like proposing to him, basically, she provides Ferdinand with two set of options, either that of wife and fellow or maiden servant. Ferdinand and Miranda both freely offer servitude to each other, and they establish the relationship of both love and reciprocal service. And Ferdinand is the one that kneels to Miranda as Miranda dictates the terms of the betrothal. Again, one that she still thinks is in revolt to her father's exact orders, which I love for her.
Yeah.
The betrothal is celebrated in a masque, which is a very royal theatrical genre. And in this masque that we see in the third act, Prospero asserts his role in forging the union. And he claims that like he forged the union by opposing it. So this is kind of a rewriting of the lover's disobedience against the authority of the sovereign of the island and framing it as being a virtue, stating that authentic love is more powerful than rote obedience or the arrangement by the sovereign without the input and the consent of the two that are being married. So Prospero legitimately did it by basically making sure Miranda and Ferdinand were on board, they consent to it, but Alonso illegitimately married his daughter to someone that she didn't consent to marry. The masque merges contract and love, like Miranda and Ferdinand's vows of love and service. And the repetition of the word contract in the masque, which was first performed in 1611, Sanchez thinks that this repetition of the word contract would have called to mind the previous year's debates over the Great Contract, many of which were printed and made available to the public. Both the king and the commons, during this Great Contract, used languages of love to describe their positions. And after the contract was defeated, a member of the Commons likened the negotiations between the king and parliament to that of a legitimate courtship in which the nation is a bride over whom the suitor, parliament, and parents, king, were bargaining. And the tyrannical parents, the king, thwarted true love between the suitor, parliament, and the bride, the nation, by keeping their daughter. So the king was holding on to the nation at the expense of parliament and the nation. This use of this discourse of love, this language of love and politics, echoes issues of royal prerogative versus popular consent. And in the final vision of Miranda and Ferdinand, Prospero discovers them playing chess, a visible metaphor of their actual and mutual engagement in the political game that is marriage. And Miranda emphasizes her own choice to play along, calling it fair play, in which her husband may cheat, and that implies a right to counsel and approval of her husband's actions, even at her expense. So it's not just that there's this free monarch and natural subjects. The relationship is...
it's like, yeah, you have the power to do that. We also have the power to let you do that and accept that you're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Prospero then depends on consent from the audience, and he's asking the audience, the subjects, to consent to freeing him. And interestingly, James said, quote, "It is a true old saying that a king is as one set on a stage whose smallest actions and gestures all the people gazingly do behold," unquote. So, like, power requires affection and trust. And
an audience.
So, yeah, our status as audience and active players both shapes and also endangers Prospero's narrative of rule. And there's a lot more in this play about like the power dynamics. They're more nuanced and complex, and the subjugated are not merely victims. Like the legitimacy of the power, I think, is noted by how much the subjects like resist or rebel. Like you don't actually have legitimate power if your subjects
are working against you. They have to accept your power. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that makes for a more interesting way to play specifically Miranda. So that's my reading. It was a lot.
Yeah.
But I found it very interesting for like thinking about how to stage these power dynamics.
Yeah. There is a lot of like feminine versus masculine in this play, and the idea of like the ruler and the ruled, and how willing are the subjects in being ruled, and that the ruler's power comes from their subjects being willing to be ruled is really very interesting. Speaking of the masculine and the feminine, my reading is more of a performance studies lens looking at how changing the gender of Prospero changes I would say, like the locus of patriarchy in this play. Like, what happens when the central character, who's often interpreted as a patriarch, as a symbol of patriarchal power, specifically over Miranda, what happens when that is not a cis man at the center? So, my reading is a chapter from Shakespeare and the Supernatural, which is edited by Victoria Bladen and Jan Brielowski. From Prospero to Prospera, Transforming Gender and Magic on Stage and Screen by Catherine Goodland. So this chapter looks at 3 21st century productions to see how does changing the gender of this central character impact specifically the depiction of magic and the source of Prospero's power. So Goodland shares a note from another scholar, Andrew Hartley. Quote, in a character like Prospero, there is relatively little that asserts the character's essential maleness. Remove that male body, replace it with a female body, and much that seems male about Prospero changes, unquote. However, Goodland notes that the text really does set up Prospero and male magic in opposition to Sycorax and female magic. So Goodland is wondering in this piece, quote, what happens then to the magic in the play when Prospero becomes Prospera, unquote.
I'm so excited to learn about this because we talked primarily about women's magic versus men's magic in our demonology episode.
Yeah.
And like it's so wildly gendered and there are so many implications based on gender.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to learn about this change, this like transformation, I guess.
Yes. So Goodland looks at 3 of the most prominent Prosperas to date at the time she was writing. This was published in 2020. So she looks at Blair Brown in the McCarter Theater's 2003 production, which was directed by Emily Mann. Olympia Dukakis in Shakespeare and Company's 2012 production, directed by Tony Simotes. And then Helen Mirren in the 2010 film adaptation directed by Julie Taymor. Goodland notes that all 3 productions had women in prominent roles behind the scenes. So we have the 2 women directors, Emily Mann and Julie Taymor. And the Shakespeare and Company production was heavily influenced by an adaptation of the play that re-envisioned the play through a feminist lens and was written by lead actor Olympia Dukakis. And at the same time, the Prosperas differ. They are played by actors of very different ages when these actors were playing these roles in different decades of their life. All over the age of 40, but different decades. To give a little bit of a background, some past performance history of Prospero, Goodland notes that Victorians, quote, focused on Prospero as the Victorian paterfamilias, unquote. So he is the Victorian family man, central figure, control of the household. Then at the end of the 19th century, there's a shift which takes the spotlight from Prospero to Caliban as, quote, an exemplar of Darwinian evolutionary theory, unquote. In the early 20th century, John Gielgud and Derek Jacobi have Freudian interpretations of Prospero, which, according to one, I know your face.
Yeah.
According to one interview, quote, energized the play by switching our interest from the power of Prospero to his psychology, unquote. Then, after the Second World War, we see a rise in the number of post-colonial tempests that are looking at the play through a post-colonial lens, as we have explored in our post-colonial theory episodes. And then only really recently has Prospero been played by a non-cis male in the professional theater. The earliest production that this article mentions is Vanessa Redgrave at the Globe in 2000.
Whoa.
Yeah. Now, again, that's not to say that
they didn't exist.
Non-professional theaters were not doing this. The earliest record we have in the professional Shakespeare institutions and professional theater is really fairly recent.
Yeah, but I feel like I don't have any data to prove this, but I feel like in theater there's very top-down kind of influence where what the professionals are doing gets carried into what amateur theater is doing. Not always, not a monolith, but
yeah, often non-professional theaters, I will say, have more of a local impact. They don't have the impact that these productions have due to scale.
Yeah.
So to start off with, both Blair Brown and Olympia Dukakis's Prosperas, their magic came from a extension of their feminine natures rather than the knowledge-based pursuit of learning that is in the text. So to start off with Blair Brown. Brown was costumed in a Renaissance-style gown and portrayed Prospero as a red-haired European noblewoman, quote, reminiscent of Elizabeth I, unquote. Brown's Prospero was also much like Elizabeth I. She played her with like having some erotic desires and pulling from the, Elizabeth potentially having dalliances with members of her court. So Goodland notes that this production, even with an attempt at color-conscious casting decisions, so for example, 2 actors of color in the production, Ezra Knight and Caroline Stephanie Clay, were cast as Noble, Sebastian, and Alonsa, respectively, as an attempt to avoid conjuring post-colonial images. The production setting was a contrast between East and West, and your face.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
therefore, Blair's costuming, very reminiscent of Elizabeth I. And then Ariel was cast, the actor Juliana Solisto, who is an American actor of color born in Indonesia, still played into the colonial narrative.
Yeah.
So even with the production seeming to attempt to avoid that, they still played into it.
Yeah.
In this production, the storm was presented as Prospero's dream, in which she possessed and was possessed by an innate magic. Goodman compares her to an earth goddess and says that on the one hand, the decision portrays, quote, an inherently powerful woman. On the other hand, the suggestion that the events transpired as a dream distanced her from responsibility for her magic. Further, as a queen, her power was an entitlement that took precedence over her gender, unquote. Critics found the production interesting, but, quote, none of them commented on the significance of the allusions to Elizabeth I, an interpretation that aligns Prospero's magic with political authority and power. Instead, they implicitly viewed this Prospero in traditional constructions of femininity, unquote. So critics, in summary, domesticated the magic into that of a mother, described Prospero and Alonza as having, quote, unquote, motherly warmth, said that, quote, casting a woman was man's most daring move, unquote, and that it worked because it suggested that Alonza was jealous and usurped power because he felt a man should be on the throne. And then Prospero's motherhood in relation to Miranda was also praised, but the characteristic of her motherhood in these reviews eclipses her power as a magician. One reviewer also implies that, quote, if a powerful woman is also a good mother, her magic is less disturbing and more palatable, unquote. That's Goodman's interpretation of some of these reviews. So they very much tie her power to this natural innate power to her being a mother. In contrast, Dukakis's production had Prospero invoke a Greek matriarch in a deliberately neutral landscape, and her Prospero did actively engage with, quote, an icon of motherhood writ large. Dukakis saw Prospero as emblematic of the matriarchal forces and spirit of prehistory, unquote. So the production drew on both Dukakis's Greek heritage and her adaptation, which was entitled The Goddess Project, although this theater specifically was not restaging The Goddess Project. Dukakis really felt invested in this project. She explained in an interview with Virginia Mason Vaughn, who is a leading international expert on the Tempest, that Dukakis herself had this experience in the wake of first wave feminism, learning about prehistory and that before the Greeks conquered Asia Minor, there were cultures that worshipped a great mother figure, female goddesses flourished outside of Greece. Dukakis herself felt a profound sense of betrayal and anger about that. So, as related by Vaughn, Dukakis saw her own betrayal mirrored in this historical shift, and from this created Prospero's backstory. So, quote, Prospero's life in Milan was pre-patriarchal, but when her brother steals her crown, a fragmentation of the spirit tears her apart, unquote. And Dukakis also saw her Prospero as finding a new kind of power on the island that drew from nature and reconnected her with these great mothers of prehistory. She saw her Prospero as primarily wrathful and said, quote, she wants vengeance. She wants to get back at all of them. She's been disempowered. She is acting out of deep humiliation. She wants her power back, unquote. Reviewers responded really well to this production, this interpretation, and felt that the vengeance came through in performance. However, reviewers did not respond to it as frightening or disturbing in the way that Dukakis was herself experiencing and envisioning it. They saw her as hard and tough, but reviewers continued to perceive this toughness as coming from motherhood rather than magic power. Reviewer Jeffrey Borak quote, felt that the stakes become just a bit higher as a parent-child relationship takes on a different texture, gains and layers of complexity, rivalry coming together. Prospera is not just any mother. This is a tough, hard, vengeful woman, unquote. And so again, like reviewers continued to ignore Dukakis's research and focused on her as a mother. Most blatantly and kind of extreme was from Ben Brantley, who was the New York Times reviewer, who turned it into a joke, saying, quote, as your own mom probably told you many times, mothers have magic powers, like reading their children's thoughts and making them feel guilty like nobody else. So just imagine what might be accomplished by a mother with full command of the mystic arts. I mean, the sort that can rule the elements and call up armies of sprites and goblins with the wave of a rod. Kind of a scary thought, huh? Well, brace yourself and allow me to introduce the mighty, moody Prospera, the stay-at-home sorcerer played by Olympia Dukakis. Fail to call this mother on her birthday at your mortal peril. Unquote. He goes on to say, quote, when the monster Caliban dares to complain about his treatment, she pierces him with a leveling glare that requires no additional witchcraft, unquote. So he continues to reduce her to just a mom and does not take Dukakis's goddess research seriously. Goodman says that Brantley's review is an extreme version of, quote, the tendency for critics to endeavor to contain Prospera's power by domesticating it under a stereotypical idea of motherhood and the patriarchal control over her body that this implies, unquote.
I'm so offended for her because again, I don't have the research on this, but I'm assuming men playing Prospero don't get the kind of comment on fatherhood and
You are ahead of me in such a good way. Yeah.
well then continue.
Yep. And then in contrast, Vaughn, the scholar who interviewed Dukakis, argued that Dukakis was much more aligned with Medea and that actually, as a woman, quote, Dukakis had greater access than a man would to the forces of passion and magic, that she could more readily tap into the darkest passions, thereby making her decision to forgive more moving and realistic than a male actor could in the same role, unquote. So Goodman then contrasts reviewers of Dukakis and Brown's portrayal. Both felt that Prospera's forgiveness was more realistic, but for the opposite reason from Vaughn. Vaughn is saying there's more of a depth of emotion that Dukakis has access to as a woman, and there's like she can go more severe in anger, more severe in rage, and that makes it more moving that she's forgiving at the end. In contrast, other reviewers also found that the forgiveness was more realistic, but because women are more naturally compassionate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Goodman notes that the arguments on both sides, quote, imply essentialist differences between the biological sexes that are difficult to substantiate, particularly now when notions of gender identity are in kaleidoscopic flux, unquote. So Goodman notes that like both of these are problematic when we recognize gender as a construct. Like Vaughn's idea that women have more access to deep emotions and also, oh, well, women are more compassionate are both gender essentialist and like not true, problematic.
Yeah, and both of these productions were after 2000.
Yeah.
So these reviewers are writing this very binary, very
Yeah.
essentialist kind of critique of or like review of
Yeah.
womanhood after decades of scholarly academic political activism about
Right.
gender. Ugh.
Goodman does take a moment to address that in this chapter of like when Dukakis is talking, like Dukakis has some things that I have not quoted here that are also gender essentialist. And Goodman says, you know, this is somebody who is not a scholar of gender studies. This is an actor. So like give some grace, and also notes that like, you know, critics who are writing for mass media publications are also not scholars of this. They are, you know, responding as members of the general public. You know, they are not writing from places with like all of this information and awareness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess it just gives me the question that I have is at what point do media reviewers need to do a little bit of research before they make statements about, because you're
Right.
right,
Yeah.
like they're not gender studies scholars, but also there's a certain level I think of understanding you have to like investigate and look into to respond to performances and productions that have certain lenses like
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, the The latest of these is only from a little over a decade ago. So, and we've, looking back 5 years ago, the time of this publication, the publication of this article, Goodland is recognizing like these views are like not well-informed views of gender at all,
That's true.
you know?
And I guess I'm also thinking like just, it was 20 years ago that the media were stalking Britney Spears and harassing women celebrities. So,
Yeah.
that puts it into perspective. So, yeah.
So yeah, well acknowledged. Moving into Helen Mirren's Prospera in the Julie Taymor film, this is a Prospera whose magic is derived from knowledge that has been acquired from studies and experiments, which is what is written in the text. And she has devised what Goodland calls a quote complex lens apparatus through which she can see the inhabitants of the island while remaining unseen to them, unquote.
Mm.
Taymor also makes a lot of design choices and choices in her direction to reference to other cultural touch points and other adaptations of Shakespeare of this play, such as Peter Brooks's Prospero's books. And she uses this sort of lens apparatus is a sort of proto camera. So Taymor takes the magic of writing that exists in Shakespeare's texts of like the books and transmutes that into a magic of filmmaking as a parallel, as this is a piece that is on film instead of in a theater. So Taymor implies that Prospera's magic, quote, emanates from this prototype of a film camera through which she presciently explores the powers and dangers of the screen-fixated lives we live today. Prospera has thus adapted one of the most significant discoveries of the Renaissance, Galileo's telescope, to devise what Sebastian Lafayette aptly describes as a proto-cinematic contraption of lenses, unquote. So just like in the original play, Prospera's power comes from illusion and observation. And just like the play, Goodland describes that there is a commentary on the politics of power in Shakespeare's time as our own, as it connects, quote, the Renaissance collective imagination regarding the connection between vision and knowledge, unquote, and also analyzes, quote, the power to capture reality and the power to display it, unquote, as well as the surveillance states of Shakespeare's England and today. Helen Mirren's Prospera's power comes from her knowledge and her study, her scientific experiments, and her inventions. However, just like the others, some reviewers could not see past Mirren's gender and Prospera's motherhood. According to Goodland, quote, there were well-known film reviewers who succumbed to the tendency to see any woman playing Prospera as an earth goddess or as a mom. Andrew O'Hear, writing for Salon, described Mirren's Prospera as a sadly elegant mom magician. It is unlikely that a male Prospero would be described in a similar way, say as a sadly elegant dad magician, unquote. So reviewers continue to misconstrue Mirren's Prospera as an earth goddess. They're unable to see her as a scientist. And Goodland notes that she emphasizes these contrasts among the reviewers, critics, and scholars, quote, because they demonstrate how difficult it can be to see a woman's identity as distinct from her role as a mother, unquote. So Goodland returns back to her central question of like what changes in the magic and our perception of the magic when this character is in a non-cis male body, or specifically a female body. And then she argues that what changes is, quote, not the magic itself, but rather the illusion of the magic, how it appears when it emanates from a differently gendered body. When a woman plays the role, many reviewers see the magic as an aspect of a domesticated form of motherhood, one that implies that the mom magician is under patriarchal control. Yet it is the reviewers themselves who exert this patriarchal control in reverting to implicitly biased ideas about women. When a man plays Prospero, his role as a parent is incidental rather than central to his magic. But when a female actor plays the role, many, though not all, see it as the reverse. The fact of motherhood is seen as the wellspring of the magic. Further, when a male actor plays Prospero, the implicit bias works in a different direction. He is viewed as less caring, more authoritative, and principally concerned about controlling the value of his daughter's body as an object of patriarchal exchange. And yet, the text indicates that he conceives of himself as a mother as well as a father to his daughter. In particular, his tender recollection that he lived from Miranda, who gave him strength to survive their treacherous sea journey, unquote. And Goodland then takes that section where Prospero does speak about like how Miranda gave him strength and specifically a full belly of strength, which gives the image of a pregnant woman.
Yeah.
And ties him to occupying both roles as both mother and father, but rarely is his parenthood commented on when it is an actor in a cis male body.
Infuriating.
Uh-huh. Goodland also argues that while we have this concept of Prospero repeatedly pitting his quote unquote male white magic against Sycorax's quote unquote female black witchcraft, there is dramatic irony when the playwright indicates that they may be more alike than different. Again, alluding to himself as having a full belly and Miranda giving him this like full belly of strength, which gives an allusion to a pregnant woman. He is just like Sycorax, who was pregnant on her arrival to this island. He creates a parallel there. And then when he abjures his rough magic, he admits that it is not this like refined magic. It's much more aligned. And Goodland argues, like, apart from their gender, what is the difference in the nature of magic wielded by them? And says that, quote, Shakespeare's dramaturgy suggests there may be no difference at all, unquote.
Maybe then it really is just Elizabeth was the prior and James is the current.
Yeah. Yeah. Goodland goes on to say that, like, in that moment that I mentioned of rough magic, Shakespeare has Prospero echo history's most famous sorceress, Medea, who is also a mom magician.
Oh my gosh.
And collapses this gender difference in modes of magic. And Goodland argues that by echoing Medea, quote, the playwright invites us to see yet another illusion vanish into thin air, unquote, the illusion of gender.
Ooh.
Ooh. So harkening back to the very beginning of my section where scholar Andrew Hartley said it's easy to just replace a male body in Prospero with a female body and nothing that is inherently male changes. Goodland argues that her analysis shows that, quote, upon closer inspection, the replacement of a male body with a female body is not so seamless after all. Bodies matter. In Taymor's film, the trauma of slavery and post-colonialism is written on Caliban's body, and the patriarchal society that will imprison Prospero once again encloses her body in a corseted gown in the film's final moments. The biases of our 21st century culture are written in the laws that endeavor to control women's bodies and in the reviews that construe their value to society under the category of motherhood rather than as individuals who are leaders and scientists. Scholars and reviewers in general perceive Prospero's magic in different terms, unquote. She goes on to say that in each of these instances, the artistic teams and the actors working on these productions perceived these Prosperos as, quote, angry, intimidating, creative, strong, and complex, regardless of whether they were portrayed as earth goddesses or scientists. All three actors playing the role were past childbearing age. Yet, in all three cases, reviewers tended to view them primarily as mothers rather than magi, unquote. Goodland wraps up her article by hoping, with hope, that while the emergence of Prospero is recent and reviewers have been very gender essentialist in their understanding and reinforce patriarchal ideas onto these Prosperas that were not intended by their artistic teams, the emergence of casting Prospero as a woman has expanded roles in Shakespeare's canon for seasoned female actors, quote, giving them a significant opportunity to portray older women as sexually complex, intellectually vibrant, and creative. In turn, the role of Prospero opens up an exploration of how our contemporary society views women in positions of power and authority. These portrayals elicit responses by reviewers that expose our culture's implicit biases. Perhaps with time, as more Prosperos tread the boards, these biases will give way and more audiences and reviewers will meet portrayals of strong women on their own terms. For the experience of seeing these female actors in a major Shakespearean role, one that is most closely associated with the playwright himself, produces its own alchemy. As if by magic, they show how performance transforms an oppressive patriarch into a complex woman of singular strength and empathy, unquote. So hopefully in the future, as Prospera or female Prospero or non-cis male Prospero becomes more common, audiences and critics will be able to see her as a complex character where her motherhood is a characteristic of her and not central to her.
Yeah, that is such a fascinating case study
Mm-hmm.
and really holds a mirror up to where the public is at.
Mm-hmm. Especially with Shakespeare, people have, as we talk about a lot, there are ideas that have been inherited in the 400 years of space between when this was written and when it is being performed today in our current moment. And that performance history of the patriarch is like almost 200 years of that before we see a Prospera.
And then when we do have a Prospera, the artistic team is so intentional
Mm-hmm.
with how to move Prospero to Prospera, but then it becomes reduced to something that is gender essentialist in a character that there's so much to talk about. There's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm so excited to watch the Julie Taymor. Like, I'm claiming it now. We're going to watch it for our wrap up. I'm so interested in how this scientist Prospera changes Prospero or enhances parts of Prospero.
Mm-hmm.
But like, you don't get that if all you're looking at is, I perceive you to be a woman, therefore I'm going to reduce you to this very misogynistic, patriarchal idea of a woman.
Yeah. And like in contrast to your reading, what this does is what it seems to do for these reviewers, even though they are being gender essentialist, is it foregrounds the relationship between Prospera, and Miranda for them. Like that becomes so much more important than the revenge plot, even than any of the other, like that becomes a much more important in the minds of the reviewers and the audiences. That dynamic between mother and daughter is apparently so much more important than father and daughter.
Very interesting. Like the reading between my reading and your reading, I think what it's highlighting for me is that there is still a long way to go in production of these characters. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if Miranda is a passive participant, if Prospero is Prospera, then this character gets reduced to mother. Like, there's a long way to go. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that both of these readings, to me, highlighted that that's crucial in,
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know, liberating Shakespeare from the Victorian concepts we hold on to today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have one final thing to say on that, which is I think what both of these have illuminated for me, like you said, we've got a long way to go. And so much of how we view these plays in this current moment is informed by the patriarchal structures of our own society, as much, if not more, than what is actually written on the page.
That's a mic drop right there.
Well, then I'll just say thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at Shakespeare Anyone Pod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 1, Scene 1, said by Hermia. I would my father looked but with my eyes.